Hello and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And as always, I want to give you all a reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors. So we would ask that you would consider becoming a regular contributor to Just and Sinner and all the work that we do. Speaking of things that we do, we have two publications that have just recently come out, if you hadn't had a chance to check those out. The first of those is a new edition of The Conservative Reformation and Its Theology by Charles Porterfield Krauth. This is a book that I often recommend, and you can pick up the copy that we just released at jspublishing.org. We also have just released a new edition of Adolf von Harless's System of Christian Ethics. This is a volume that we published back in 2013, and we've redone it. It looks a lot nicer. Typeface is better. New cover. So we have a new edition of that, which is available, again, also at jspublishing.org. This is part of a new series that we are doing on ethics. And so we have a number of volumes dealing with Christian theological and philosophical ethics. We'll be releasing a volume from Widener, one from Valentine, and then Ernst Sartorius and some others that we have coming up as well in that series. So today we're going to be continuing our lecture series that we have been doing on makers of the modern world. And in the last one of these that I did, we talked about Michel Foucault. So we are now, if you think about the kind of major postmodern, post-structuralist thinkers in the 20th century, the two names that really come to the forefront more than anybody else will be Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. So Derrida is the topic of today. We're going to be exploring his thoughts, following up on that of Foucault. Now, the two of these individuals, they disagreed on a number of points and at times didn't seem to like each other very much. However, they are both broadly part of the same movement. So they come to similar conclusions on a lot of ideas, though not exactly. If you haven't watched the program on Saussure and structuralism, that will help to give some background if you want to get an understanding of what's going on with structuralism, which is what then post-structuralism Derrida is coming out of. All right, you're also going to see some similar ideas to Roland Barthes in some of these things because they're writing around the same time as well and come up with a lot of similar conclusions. All right, so we're going to talk about Jacques Derrida. Well, as we do, we explore people's lives first. So we're going to look at a little bit of his biography, and then we're going to jump into the ideas, the primary ideas of Derrida and how they influence our world today. Okay, so in terms of life, we've got Jacques Derrida, born on July 15th in 1930 in Algeria. He was born into a Jewish family. He is eventually going to, which is going to become clear as we look at this, very adamantly reject the beliefs of the Jewish faith, certainly the beliefs of Hebrew Scripture. He is going to be an adamant opponent of the Jewish faith in many ways in some of the ideas that he formulates, especially with his critique of what he calls logocentrism. But he is born into a Jewish family, so he is of Jewish ancestry. He is a French citizen. France had control of Algeria, so he was a French citizen. However, this is a time in Europe where things were not going too well for the Jewish people, if you know anything about European history in the middle of the 20th century. So 1930s into the 1940s, an anti-Jewish sentiment is starting to grow. So anti-Jewish laws that were enacted forced Derrida out of his public school that he was attending into an all-Jewish institution. So there is a bit of a segregation going on in Algeria of Jewish students going to separate schools from Gentile students. And while he was there in school, he began to read philosophy. He was frustrated, and he was clearly the world was going through a lot of difficult things at this time in the 1940s. And he, as a Jew, was certainly seeing the rise of anti-Jewish sentiments. He was frustrated, he was bitter, and he began to read the same philosophers that I knew a lot of frustrated teens read when I was in high school. People start to get angry and they start to read Nietzsche. So he starts to read Nietzsche, Sartre, Camus. These are, they're all broadly existentialist. I mean, Nietzsche becomes a very prominent influence on existentialist philosophy. Sartre and Camus are two of the primary, if not the two primary existentialist philosophers in France. He attends the Lycée Louis le Grand in Paris, where he studies under Etienne Born. He goes to Paris. He then pursues his master's degree, where he befriends Althusser. Now, Althusser is a figure that we have discussed before. We had a separate program on Althusser, and he is a highly influential Marxist philosopher. Derrida, therefore, encounters Marxism. He encounters a lot of leftist thoughts. He encounters existentialism and Nietzsche. But his primary interest, at least at this time in his own lecturing and writing, was on the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. I will probably do something separate on Edmund Husserl. I haven't done that just yet in this series, at least as I'm recording this. But Husserl is someone who he's kind of the epitome of one who takes Kant's division between noumenal and phenomenal and really just focuses in on that phenomenal realm. And we talked about the question of how do you even know that the noumenal realm actually exists at all in Kant. So a very brief overview of what Husserl's interests are. I'll have to do something separate on that. But at this time, Derrida is influenced largely by Edmund Husserl. That's who he is writing his dissertation on. And some of his interaction with Husserl becomes rather influential. He then comes to the United States. He studies at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. While he is there, he begins reading the writing of James Joyce. And James Joyce was very influential on a number of these post-structuralist thinkers. We saw the same thing with Roland Barthes as well. There's good reason for that. James Joyce, if you haven't read his book Ulysses, you should try to read it sometime. It's very difficult to read. I don't like the book in the slightest, but it is considered a masterpiece of modernist literature because the way that Joyce just plays with language throughout the entire text. The entire text is kind of meaningless in many ways, but is also filled with meaning in other ways. So the playing with words, the kind of word type games that these modernist authors are using is going to turn Derrida's attention largely to language, and particularly to the question of writing and how writing is to be understood. So there are passages in Ulysses that are just nonsense words, and there are passages that are just consistent references to all sorts of other literary works. So it's very self-referential. It references all sorts of other things. It's a book that some people say you can't really enjoy or understand unless you have a lengthy commentary on it, and do with that what you will. I think it's kind of silly to have to read a lengthy text on a book to understand the book, but okay, that is what it is. So he then gets married in 1957 to a psychoanalyst, Marguerite Couturier. I'm sorry, I'm probably totally pronouncing that wrong, and I apologize for that. So he does teach some, he tutors some prior to this, but he begins his then college level teaching career in 1960 at the Sorbonne. The Sorbonne is one of the most influential universities in France, and it was so since the late medieval period. It really is central to things like the Renaissance in France. Through his friendship with Althusser, he then leaves for ENS, where he would go, and this is the place where he had originally gotten his degree, and he himself had studied, where he met Althusser earlier, where he would teach until 1984. So he's there for a pretty significant period in his career, and the period in his career that's going to be the most influential in terms of his writing projects. He really rises to prominence in his influence in the 1960s. Now, the 1960s were an era where radicals in general started to receive a lot more respect, a lot more adoration, youth following. We've talked about this before, that in France, the intellectual was a kind of celebrity in the mid-20th century in the way that we don't really have in the United States. Maybe we have some kind of celebrity intellectuals, or what we call public intellectuals, but not in the same manner that France did. So the rise of student movements, people start to look to leftist intellectuals for inspiration, for ideas. And it's this era where Derrida becomes popular, along with Foucault. So they're generally the same time period, same with Roland Barthes as well. So he rises to fame largely for his work on the topic of structuralism. Now, structuralism, if you're not familiar with structuralism, I would urge you again to watch the video or listen to the podcast I did on structuralism, looking at the structuralist thinkers, such as Saussure and Levi Strauss as well. So he gives a very famous lecture on structuralism, kind of rework structuralism. So at the very beginning of his career, he's really considered to be a structuralist. Later, looking back, people start to see Derrida as the beginnings of post-structuralism. The same would be true of Roland Barthes. He ends up receiving an honorary doctorate from Columbia University. And the same year, he does get his own actual earned doctorate. He gets a state doctorate from the University of Paris. Later, he's going to get a number of other honorary doctorates for his work as well. But the only other one that I have mentioned in the outline here is his doctorate from the University of Cambridge in 1992. Now, the reason why that one in particular is mentioned rather than some of the other honorary doctorates he received is because there was a bit of controversy surrounding Jacques Derrida's reception of this so-called honorary doctorate from Cambridge University. There were a number of analytic philosophers, three very prominent ones, who wrote a letter of protest against Derrida's receiving this award because Derrida was seen as kind of a joke, a faux intellectual who just plays word games and doesn't really have anything positive and constructive to say. And I have a quote in here soon from one of those philosophers talking about him. Okay. In his later life, he ends up becoming full professor at École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, which is, again, probably pronounced wrong, but oh well, in 1984. So he is then made an honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1985. And he can't be a full member because it's the American Academy, and they do have provisions where they bring some, European individuals who are highly influential as honorary members of the organization. So the point is here you see that he is very well respected across the globe, and whether he should be or not is another question, but he is somebody that has a significant amount of influence. He becomes full professor of the humanities at the University of California in Irvine. So he is in the United States from 1986 until 2004. And he dies of pancreatic cancer in 2004. He taught at several other universities, so he was a visiting lecturer all over the place. So some of these are mentioned here. Yale, NYU, Stony Brook, the New School, these are all in my area of the country here. So largely New York, Yale's in Connecticut, but not too far from New York. But the point is he has a very influential career that spans really across fields, largely in the humanities, but his original work was in philosophy and then linguistics. All right, so there are the basics of his life. There's a lot more that could be said. I'm kind of going through this rather quickly because what I really want to focus on is the ideas of Derrida, but to get some background of his influence, the people who influenced him, where he comes from, is helpful as we move on. So Quine, Marcus, and Armstrong, these are three analytic philosophers. Quine is the one that is pictured here. If you're not familiar with Quine, he wrote the very famous essay on the two dogmas of empiricism. Very influential analytic philosopher. If you know anything about analytic philosophy in the 20th century, you know about Quine. Well, I guess analytic philosophy really is a 20th century phenomenon, but yeah. So, but anyway, so they're very well respected, very well known analytic philosophers, and they say this about Derrida's writing. They call it little more than semi-intelligible attacks upon the values of reason, truth, and scholarship. So what you see there is the kind of polarization that Derrida's writings and ideas bring about, and that kind of polarization still exists today. I tend to be on the same train as these analytic philosophers regarding Derrida, so I'm not hiding my biases here. But let's talk about some of the primary ideas that you find in Derrida. Now, Derrida explores different kinds of centrism that are critiques of the West. So throughout Derrida's writings, and you see this in a lot of these revolutionary leftist thinkers at this time, is just a massive criticism of the Western world. The West is wrong, in all sorts of ways, in its ethics and religious beliefs and general philosophical conceptions. So I think that quote on the prior slide really is accurate to Derrida. He really does want to destroy the West and destroy the rationality that has been privileged in the West. He wants to destroy the Jewish and Christian heritage of the West and the Greco-Roman heritage of the West. There really is nothing that Derrida is beyond attacking in his writings. So he is a very radical revolutionary, and that comes across pretty clearly, even just from a little bit of reading Derrida. So you can understand why he is such a controversial figure in his writings. So as he's critiquing the West, he accuses the West of having all of these different kinds of centrisms. And this is very similar to rhetoric you'll find today that largely comes from Derrida. You look at people talking about Eurocentrism, for example, in critiques of Western culture. People talking about, male centrism. Well, I guess that's probably not the term they used. Phallocentrism and all sorts of other ways to describe it, or what gender theorists, including Derrida, uses a little bit of that kind of language as well to support, feminism. But we see this general kind of critique that the West has privileged certain things over others, and the West is wrong in privileging certain things over others. As we're going to see in Derrida, there really is no accurate privileging of anything over anything else. So the first of these, and this shows up in his early writing, and particularly with his interactions with Saussure. So as we talked about, structuralism really is where Derrida starts. So he has a writing called Of Grammatology, which is one of his most influential books in 1967. And it's in this text that he begins to outline the general ideas of what he calls phonocentrism. So basically, where this starts with Derrida is it's his contention. This contention has been challenged by a lot of critics of Derrida, by the way. But Derrida's contention is that the Western tradition has historically emphasized speech over writing. Now, what he's really doing here is critiquing Saussure and Saussure's structuralism and arguing that this is the Western tradition. And that's a major problem in Derrida, because he makes a lot of sweeping generalizations about what is the Western tradition. And if you've read widely in the Western tradition, it's oftentimes you'll read Derrida and you'll start to ask, well, is that really the Western tradition, or is he just reading this modernist figure who says he's representing the Western tradition? So things are a lot more complex than Derrida allows them to be in a lot of these critiques. But in Saussure, with his structuralism, Saussure proposes that there are two different ways to talk about speech. For the kind of basic structure of structuralism is that we make a distinction between the sign and the signified, so that there is a reality that's signified with a linguistic sign. So the word is a linguistic sign. That sign points beyond itself to something else. So if I say tree, that is the sign. There is nothing inherent in the utterance of those particular sounds that is identified with what's in your head when I say tree. Instead, we are just attaching, as human societies, and something our brains do structurally with regard to language, is we tie particular words to different objects or ideas that aren't necessarily actually connected to any of the syllables that we are actually uttering. So we have a difference between the verbal utterances, which are the sign, and then the thing signified is what we are referencing with that linguistic sign. So Saussure, at least this is Derrida's critique, is that what Saussure does then is say, when we're talking about the signs, there is a privileging of the spoken word, the speaking of the sign, and writing the sign down is then a reflection of the spoken. So if I say the word tree and I write down the word tree, well, the writing is really just another set of symbols that's kind of deferred. And those sets of symbols, which are the letters, are reflecting the thing that is in speech, which is then reflecting the thing itself. So you're kind of two steps removed now from the thing when you're doing writing instead of speech. And that's how Derrida at least is framing Saussure here. So what Derrida sees in Saussure's proposal is that there's some kind of purer time, supposedly, when speech was not corrupted by the written word. So for Derrida in his reading, this means that the written word, when people started to begin to write, this was some kind of corruption of some original purity, and that was the purity of speech, so that it was a kind of downgrade to now begin writing things down instead of just sharing them orally through speech. And what he's going to talk about this as a metaphysics of presence, that something is more real if it is present with you, right? So that the speaker is actually present speaking, and that makes it more real than if the speaker writes something down, say, and then, it's mailed to you, because you don't have the actual author present with you. And he says that's a false privileging of presence, where he doesn't believe that such a thing actually exists. So Derrida tries to get rid of that division between writing and speech. He says, no, written words are signifiers just as much as speech is. So when you write the word tree, it is just as much a signifier of tree as speech would be. And then we're going to get to the question of whether that actually means the tree actually exists. And Derrida can't really say yes at all, because ultimately he ends up coming to the conclusion that language is essentially meaningless. It's just language is just a reference to other language and nothing in reality itself. So what he critiques then is the assumption of the West that the presence of subjects creates this immediacy, which is this metaphysics of presence, that is not there within the written text. So he's saying this is a mistaken assumption of the West, that there is something more real if there's an actual person speaking to you than if you just have a written document that has words that are written down. Derrida is critical then of the human centricity of phonocentrism, because it assumes the centrality of the human subject, the human person. So we say that, well, if the human person is present, that makes it more accurate. Well, he's saying you're privileging the human person. So in some ways, this philosophy is kind of anti-human in some ways. It's an anti-humanism, and we see this in the denial that there is any subject at all. Something you see in Foucault as well. There is no real human subject. There is no transcendent self at all. That's just something that's created by signs and the linguistic system itself. So he creates this idea of binary oppositions, which we'll get a little more into. But essentially, Derrida says that speech largely, but also particularly Western culture, so he's talking specifically about the West, but this is true more generally, is that the Western world, Western culture is made up of a bunch of oppositions of one thing versus another thing. And for Derrida, we kind of know something by what it's not. So we know things by way of oppositions. And one of these oppositions, and Derrida critiques these oppositions, but one of these here is this opposition between speech and writing. So we assume that there are two different things. They're opposed to one another. One is better than the other. And Derrida is trying to say, no, we need to kind of reverse that binary opposition. We don't need to privilege one thing over the other, so we don't need to privilege speech over writing. The conclusions that Derrida comes to are very similar to the conclusions that Roland Barthes comes to in his article on the death of the author, where Roland Barthes talks about the lack of the author actually importing any meaning into the text itself. And I think I do think that there is a reason why both of those figures really liked James Joyce so much, that they're starting to say authorial intent does not really matter. So the intent of the author in writing the text doesn't really matter. What really matters is just the text itself. The text is kind of a thing of itself. It doesn't need the author. Who's to say that the interpretation of the author is any more valid than the interpretation of the reader? So do we need to kind of discern and decide what some author's intentions were in writing a text? Well, who's to say that intentionality actually defines what the text is? The text is a thing in itself for both of these figures. And Barthes' essay is, I believe it's just a year earlier. I think it was 1966 that he released that essay. So grammatology and the death of the author coming out at almost the same time, and they're proposing somewhat similar ideas, certainly overlapping ideas here. Now, the second centrism that we're going to be talking about here that Derrida is critical of, this is one that's talked about probably most often in terms of Derrida's relationship to Western culture, and probably not so much the phonocentrism unless you're dealing specifically with his philosophy or his ideas of linguistics, because most people looking at the history of Western culture don't just come to the assumption that the West does indeed privilege speech so significantly over writing. That's certainly a thing to be challenged. I mean, most of the major, how was culture preserved? I mean, culture is largely preserved through texts, through the biblical text, right? Religions are dependent upon religious texts, especially Christianity, and it's certainly in its Protestant form that the text itself becomes the ultimate authority. over the living authorities, because those living authorities are can be held up to that written word and critiqued on the basis of that written word. So I think it's a very kind of odd claim to make, but he's really critiquing Saussure, and I'm not sure how broadly it really works in terms of his critique of the Western tradition. But this one's a little more clear when we're talking about logocentrism here. So to be clear, the term logocentrism, I mentioned it's first coined by Ludwig Klages. Now, logocentrism is... So it's an idea that exists prior to Derrida. And there are other philosophers that talk about logocentrism as well. But we need to particularly be looking at what Derrida means by his use of this term. And nearly everybody who uses the term logocentrism is talking about the centrality of the logos, the centrality of reason, is what we're talking about with the logos. Now, the term logos has been used as a philosophical concept at least as far back as Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus is one of the earliest of the Greek philosophers. Heraclitus precedes Plato and Aristotle. And Heraclitus talked about, he believed that reality is essentially this process of change. And I have a short video on Heraclitus if you want Heraclitus's ideas. And he referred to this kind of ultimate reality, which is, he says, as fire, as Zeus. There is this kind of mediating reason between God and the world, what he calls the logos. And this mediating reason means that the world is intelligible. So the world is intelligible because there is some kind of divine reason that the human person actually has access to, so that we can understand the world in reality as it actually is. Very kind of short, brief overview of Heraclitus. And if you want to see, again, a video on his thought, I do have one of those. It's like 15 minutes, just quick overview where Heraclitus is coming from, what his ideas were. But that idea of the logos then gets picked up largely by Plato. It also is a significant part of the Neoplatonic tradition that develops after him. And it is in the Gospel of John. So it becomes a very significant part of the Christian tradition. And so John chapter 1 speaks about how in the beginning was the Word, or the Logos. The Logos was with God. The Logos was God. So the second person of the Holy Trinity, the eternally begotten Son, is the Logos, is the Word. So the Son in Christianity is referred to as the Word, and it is the Word who reveals truth to us, reveals God to us, as Paul says in Colossians, the fullness of the divine nature dwells in him. And so the reason then, according to Christianity, the world is intelligible is because God has made it intelligible through the Son. The light that enlightens every man is the kind of language that John uses. And certainly early Christian interpreters, and there's a significant amount of debate about that particular phrase, but at least it seems like the majority of early Christian interpreters reading that through a Neoplatonic lens tend to think that what he's talking about here is that what John is talking about is that we reason by means of the enlightening of the Logos, or of the Son. So the Son is that wisdom or that reason through which we can understand the world. So there is this centrality of reason. The Word, the Logos here is the kind of all the encapsulating term here in the Western world that goes back at least as far as Heraclitus. Derrida's critique is largely from Plato onward. And so this logocentrism, in some ways, this is definitive of the West as a whole. If you reject the logocentric nature of culture, then you're really rejecting the entirety of Western culture. I mean, that's what Derrida is doing here. He's critiquing everything. Because logos is this notion that, I mean, you can extend all the way back from, Heraclitus into the Old Testament, into the New Testament, into the Christian Middle Ages, and then even into rationalism and the Enlightenment, where both the Enlightenment and critics of the Enlightenment are both centered in some ways on the centrality of reason, view it very differently, and how you approach reason becomes very different. But he's throwing all of it out. I mean, he's just saying, let's get rid of all of it, because it's all logos-centric. It's all centered on reason or rationality. So the centering of the logos for Derrida has been wrong. It's just an assumption of the West. It's something that people do in the West. We center things on the logos or reason. And I have some words here to kind of translate what logos means for Derrida here, because he uses it in some different ways. So we say logic truth, reason or rationality, as well as transcendence. So Derrida really is a critic of anything transcendent, any kind of transcendent source of reality that we really have access to the world as it is, because there is this enlightenment of a divine source that causes us to really understand meaning and purpose in any sense beyond our individual selves in our societal systems and structures. So logocentric philosophy, that which Derrida is critiquing here, believes that there is a unified order, meaning in the universe through which things are to be understood. So if we say that there is any inherent meaning or purpose in the world, that is, if we're saying that what we mean is a universal claim, we mean something more than our systems create meaning or purpose, or I personally create meaning or purpose. If we're using that in any objective, real sense apart from ourselves, Derrida is saying that's logocentrism, and for him that is mistaken. Derrida ties logocentrism to two roots. And one is Judaism, which is why I said, yes, he's Jewish by ancestry, but he really is a critic of the foundational points of certainly the Jewish scripture in the Old Testament. So he's critiquing he's critiquing Judaism, that this idea that there is a universal God with a universal law. There is a singular God. This is a monotheistic, non-pluralist system that we find in the Old Testament, that there are things that are objectively right and wrong, and that there's a world that is objectively ordered and has meaning and purpose and value in itself, as well as Hellenistic philosophy, being the Greek philosopher. So he's saying that it's derived from both the Old Testament and it is also derived from the ancient Greeks. And within Christianity, you kind of get the bringing together of those two realities of Judaism and Hellenism, and the notion of Christ as the Logos. And all of that for Derrida is to be adamantly rejected. Something that logocentrism does, which again Derrida sees as wrong, is that it privileges hierarchies as inherently good and rational. And so within the Western world, and this is just anthropologically and psychologically true. You get any group of people together and a hierarchy is created immediately. I mean, you can look at elementary school kids when they do a school project. You get 3 kids together in a group, and what happens? Well, somebody takes the lead. If nobody takes the lead, the project doesn't do well. It's just what people do when they organize, is they create structure and hierarchy. Somebody becomes the leader. You watch kids at play when they're making games, which I've done watching my kids play games, and they create hierarchies. That's just how people function. There's not really a way to function outside of that. But this is what the world, since at least since Marx, has continually tried to do, is create some kind of society or way of living without hierarchies, which is just opposed to everything that is in our nature. So Derrida is saying that the Western world, this logocentric world, privileges hierarchies as inherently good. And so Derrida is saying hierarchy is actually bad. These are not rational things when we've created these hierarchies. And he ends up saying that it is patriarchal and phallocentric. There's the great word there, phallocentric. That's the kind of word, if you ever read like a Judith Butler, who I'm also going to be doing a talk on, that's the kind of language that shows up all over the place there. So phallocentric, meaning penis-centric, man-centric. So that the problem with hierarchies is that it's naturally, we're privileging the male over the female. We're privileging the white person over someone who is not white. We're privileging, this person over that person, the heterosexual over the homosexual. You see this kind of rhetoric all over the place. And it's this idea that we create these binary oppositions and then create hierarchies out of them and then tell other people that those hierarchies are inherently rational. But Derrida is saying they're not inherently rational. They're not inherently good. They just are what they are. So we have to kind of take them apart and deconstruct them. All right. So then we get this idea of deconstruction. So let's start to explain exactly what deconstruction is. Now, if you're talking about Derrida in a room full of people who don't know a lot about philosophy, if they know anything about Derrida, they probably know the word deconstruction. Now, today this has been used in ways that are completely inconsistent with what Derrida is talking about. I know that now people are talking about deconstructing their faith all the time in a way that is completely incoherent with the actual original concept, which I will say Derrida would probably love that, because Derrida doesn't really believe in meaning in language, so he'd probably love the idea that his words mean something completely different when other people use them. But it drives me crazy. So what he means by deconstruction is not what a lot of people mean by deconstruction when they're using the term in popular parlance. So let's talk about what he does mean by his project of deconstruction. I mean, to some extent, it's like, well, deconstruction is the opposite of constructing something, so it's taking something apart. And that's true, but there's a particular way in which that's the case. So binary oppositions, we've touched on this a bit already, but binary oppositions are the idea that you have one thing versus another thing, and you understand things by their opposite. So you understand white in that it's not black. You understand black in that it's not white. You understand short as it's opposed to tall, right? Because what the heck is tall? That's a pretty relative term anyway, unless you have something that's short and something that's average. The idea of tall doesn't make any sense. Because if you have an object without any context, you don't know if it's tall because you don't know what size it normally is, right? So in some way, you know tall because you know short, and you know short because you know tall, right? So big or small, we use these things all the time. And Derrida is not entirely wrong linguistically. I mean, certainly it is the case that a lot of what we do know through contrast. And I don't know that any linguist is going to totally deny that we know things by contrast. I mean, there certainly is truth to what he's getting at here. But here is the place where Derrida, I think, goes beyond what is necessitated by the evidence itself. Well, in two ways. One is that it's totally arbitrary, so that this is just it's arbitrary that these things are opposed to one another. It's not inherent in the things themselves, because linguistic signs are all arbitrary. Now, some of this goes back to Saussure, because Saussure does speak about arbitrariness of language. So I mentioned the example of tree earlier. The fact that those particular sounds are connected to this thing that we call a tree, the thing itself, is somewhat arbitrary. Like, there's no reason why tree, that particular sound references the thing rather than the sound blugaboo or something. There's just random noises that we have attached to an object or an idea. So it is, to some extent, arbitrary. All right. So this arbitrariness does show up first with Saussure, but Derrida takes it a bit farther. And he's saying that these oppositions that we have between things and others, he's not just talking about the arbitrariness of the sign in relation to the signified, but he's saying that it's kind of all arbitrary. There is no inherent reason why, say, man and woman would be opposites. We just create opposites. That's just what we do. But that doesn't mean they really are. They're not really. We've just kind of arbitrarily drawn these lines wherever we have. So I've got some examples of these that show up in Derrida at different points. So good and evil. That one's really obvious. And that goes back to Nietzsche. Which in his book Beyond Good and Evil, where he talks about how we characterize things as good versus evil rather than good versus bad, and that therefore shapes how we view the world. And he challenges the notion that we really can objectively speak about a good and evil. Male and female, there's the big one there. So when you talk about being non-binary, okay, this is Derrida. That's just all Derrida, straight Derrida. We don't get there without Derrida. That there is, this strict, that binaries are bad, right? There is this, and Derrida's system is not so simplistic as just to say binaries are bad, because he kind of sees them actually as essential for language. But flowing out of Derrida, we get this idea that, binaries are bad. And that comes out of Derrida saying that all Western binaries are used as kind of oppressive and arbitrary. So it leads to the conclusion that binaries are kind of bad. So you want to subvert the binaries, or that you revert them. So you have a lot of feminist thought uses this binary opposition idea and reverts the binary opposition, where you have female then over male, and you do the same thing with these destruction of the binary altogether with things like non-binary identities. That's all Derrida. Okay, the speech and writing, we've already talked about that. He sees that as very significant in the Western world, largely critiquing Saussure. Mind and body, there's another example of one that Derrida's critical of, and so is Foucault. Foucault is, I've said this in leftist thought in general, and I've said this over and over again as we approach these different thinkers. The primary place where they go wrong is the denial of the soul. And I think everything else really seems to stem from that. And then there are plenty of other systemic issues, but the notion of the self really kind of disappears. And that's a common thread among leftist thought from wildly different thinkers and interpretations and perspectives. So classically, there is a distinction between mind and body, and that's the mind-body dualism is from Descartes, but it has its roots in what is just the body-soul distinction. And Derrida is saying that's a wrong distinction, that we privilege, say, mind over body. He's saying that's not the case. Foucault kind of does the same thing, which is why Foucault's focus in terms of resistance is on the body. Power is that which controls the bodies. He talks about biopower. So to resist, we need to use our bodies as instruments of resistance, which means that we are just as deviantly sexual in any way we possibly can be for Foucault. And Derrida, so he does some pretty similar things. And by the way, he does how do I say this without being demonetized on YouTube? Derrida is part of, along with Foucault and Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, is part of a petition to get rid of age of consent laws in France. Just leave that as it is. But that's a common theme in leftist intellectuals. I mean, reading like the signatories of that document, it's kind of a who's who of leftist intellectuals in France. So interesting. And so I think that that's a consequence of what's going on here. So I think when you do see things today like, Drag Queen Story Hour or whatever, I do think that it is in some ways a very consistent outworking of some of the ideas that you find in these thinkers in terms of their trying to get rid of the established norms of what is okay and what's not, and trying to kind of liberate the body in some way. All right. So then we've got, civilized versus uncivilized. So, for example, if you talk about, civilized society being, Western European society, and an uncivilized society being one that is generally considered like a third world country. And now I know that terminology isn't used anymore. It's kind of Derrida's influence that we don't want to use that terminology anymore because we don't want to categorize some people as civilized and some as uncivilized. So that's just a false opposition there. Normal versus abnormal. This binary opposition has been used or the overthrowing of this binary opposition has been used to justify all sorts of deviant sexual practices and all sorts of other practices that are not great either. But it shows up there in that area more than anywhere else because certain things, seem abnormal to us. And for someone like Derrida, that's just the result of society making an opposition between normal and abnormal. It's not that it actually is abnormal. So this is why we're trying to destigmatize everything in our culture, because stigmas are bad, because stigmas are not inherent. Stigmas are just created by society that's oppressive. That's it. There is no abnormal. And this is why people try to kind of inoculate themselves to things that they obviously see as abnormal. So somebody, in gender transition, say, obviously, if you see somebody that is in the midst of that, or somebody who's non-binary, or is positing that they are those things, it is going to look abnormal, and there is going to be a natural kind of revulsion in you to that. Like there is, you are going to think it is normal. It is not normal when you see, a man in makeup and a dress, and there is something in you that's going to just kind of naturally be like, that's not a normal thing. But we're trying to destigmatize things, which is essentially trying to kind of go into the structures of our brain in what we know and learn as kids, and just is inherently there in terms of reality itself, and say, no, that is a beautiful woman, when, it's not. But what you are doing there is you're trying to get rid of what are the false structures of what is normal and abnormal. So you're trying to say, we get rid of that. There is no normal and abnormal. And that's just kind of societally pushed upon us. And so we all are playing this, emperor has no clothes kind of game where we're all pretending that these things are normal, even though they're clearly not. And we know they're not. People are just have to be righteous, pretend that they are. Okay. Then we have heterosexual, homosexual binary opposition. That one's pretty obvious. So this shows up in a lot of queer theory and whatnot. So oppositions are hierarchical necessarily. So Derrida is saying that, well, why are these? He's saying, okay, so we have all these binary oppositions. This is how people function in the Western world, as if they don't exist in other. This exists in every culture, right? This is not just the West. But these guys are so Eurocentric that they can't understand that. So okay, so these oppositions, they would say, preserves the status quo. So it keeps things as they are. We saw this in Foucault as well. And so it's to basically preserve those who are already in power. So if people are in power, those people in power determine what things are are normal and what are abnormal. They create the oppositions, and they use the oppositions to keep themselves in power and to oppress others. So, of course, these oppositions are all totally politicized, and the reason why we have these oppositions is so that the people who are in power can oppress and hurt those who are not in power, because everything ultimately comes down to a relationship of power and oppression for the left, and that's just what happens here. These oppositions create the impression of transcendent meaning. So we have the impression, and this is instilled in us from our young training as children, we have this impression that some things are good and some things are not, or some things are inherent and some things are disordered or ordered. And Derrida is saying that essentially is that's not referring to anything that's actually real in terms of any transcendent value. Instead, what we're doing here is we are creating these kind of false oppositions in order to force things to look like they're transcendent in order to keep group X, Y, or Z in power. And so that's why, conversations about religion or about faith, when, I get into conversations about, public policy specifically related to, homosexuality, and say that if I say I don't want to perform same-sex weddings because I believe that's something that goes against my religious convictions, the kind of immediate response is you're doing that to oppress somebody, rather than any question of is there inherent or transcendent meaning in marriage at all as an institution. Well, that's not even a question that people are thinking, because the question of transcendence is just totally out the window, and what is real is totally out the window. It's just a question of power. Are you exercising power, and who are you using that power to oppress? I mean, those are the conclusions we jump to. All right. So what deconstruction does, the practice of deconstruction, is it reverses the order. So what deconstruction does is it tries to show, it's kind of a tool of working both in politics and literary theory, to show the arbitrariness of those oppositions by reverting them. So this shows up in literary theory, where you have, say, an analysis of a text, and this is where you have a feminist reading of a text, or a Marxist reading of a text, or a queer reading of a text, where you take a text and you say, what happens if we kind of read the female as the one in power in this text? So read it through that lens, that the female is in power, not the man. So you're using this as a tool to deconstruct a text. You're taking it apart and reversing the order, the power order that's in the text. And this happens with politics and culture. So the whole idea is you revert that opposition. You take one person that's oppressed and kind of put them on top, and then make the oppressor the oppressed, right? You just reverse the oppression. So the hierarchy to some extent is necessary, but you got to reverse these things, and that's how change is made, by deconstructing, by reverting the binary. So anything that we think of as normal, the project of deconstruction wants us to say, well, what if that's actually abnormal, and the abnormal thing is normal? All right. Then we have this idea that shows up in Derrida. This is a very popular, famous idea in Derrida as well. This is difference. So difference means both difference and deferral. Think of it as meaning both things. So this has to do with the language that we use here. And we talked about this in the last section, as we talked about Saussure as well, that words are understood in contrast to other words. So how do we understand, again, how do I understand what black is? Well, I understand it in contrast to white. So I understand things in contrast to one another. This is how we create these binary oppositions. But this is what happens in Derrida's system here, is that when I'm defining, say, black, I'm really defining it by the difference between black and white. This is why it sounds like difference here. So do I understand what black actually is as a thing itself? Well, not really. I just know that it's not white, or it's not blue, or it's not green, or it's not red. So I'm kind of eliminating all the other things that it's not really understanding what it is. It's kind of an apophatic method of understanding just terminology or words in general. So words for Derrida are not truly signifiers of objective things. So they are not truly objectifiers of forms or essences. And so this is where Derrida is going to differ very significantly from certainly the classical Greek tradition with Plato, and really just the tradition of the West in general, that there is an understanding that when I use a word, it signifies something that is actually real. This is the realm of the forms for Plato, or essences, things as they actually are. There is no direct correlation for Derrida between those things. Instead, he says that meaning, when we're talking about the meaning of a certain word, that meaning is basically just endlessly deferred. So if I'm trying to define a word, I can't actually define the word by pointing to something in reality. All I can do is define the word by talking about other words. So if I, define, if I define what a table is, I could say, a table is something that has a flat surface that has legs that hold it up. I mean, I don't know what kind of definition of a table you want to give, but hey, there's my off-the-cuff definition. So, then you say, okay, well, that sounds good, but what does flat mean? Oh, okay. Well, flat is something that, is not, it's all kind of at the same, elevation. It doesn't bump, or it doesn't have a variation in height in itself. You could define that and say, okay, but what's height? Oh, well, height is, and you keep deferring. So every time you're trying to define a word, all you can do is, for Derrida, define it by other words. And so definitions are by nature just deferral. If you look at a dictionary, you read, what do you do? If you want to understand a word, you look at a bunch of other words. That's not pointing you to anything outside of the text. All it's doing is pointing you to other words. Well, how do I make the leap from a word to a thing itself? For Derrida, you can't. There is no leap. There is no real connection at all. So again, this is the taking Saussure's arbitrariness of the signs and taking it to its most extreme conclusion, that there really are no signifieds at all. There are just signs, and there are just signs that reference other signs, and there you go. So every word can only be defined by other words. It's endlessly deferred. So here is where some of this idea of difference is formulated as Derrida's response to Husserl. Husserl is the individual he did his dissertation on, we talked about earlier. He says and Husserl tried to get behind our understanding of phenomena, to understand something objective about how we perceive memory or perception. For Derrida, there is no constancy in the mind really at all. So that kind of study, he says, is just, there's no point. Everything just constantly changes. Your perception of things changes. Your memory constantly changes. So you're not going to find these kind of objective universal structures in the mind that someone like Kant would talk about. And many that are influenced by Kant would do something very, very similar. So he says the semiological system is not objective at all. So the system of signs, semiology being the study of signs. So he's saying that the system of signs is not objective. It's totally arbitrary. I have Strauss there because Levi Strauss, he's talked about in the structuralism talk, but Strauss argued that not that there's necessarily something objective in a transcendent sense about the system, but there are kind of universal structures of signs that we can explore, especially through looking at a variety of different cultures from arising in different contexts. We can find these general kind of structures of the mind or human perception or how just humans operate. And Derrida says any search for anything systematically objective in our system of signs, we just need to get rid of that idea that we can find anything there at all. Then he says there is no metaphysic of subject, meaning that there is no subject. There is no transcendent self at all. The self, for Derrida, is created by this system of oppositions. So just as Foucault says we really are the product of our power relations, Derrida is going to say something very similar, that we are just the product of those semiological arbitrary systems created by binary oppositions. So there is no real inherent self. And as I keep saying, this really, I think, is the major issue with a lot of these thinkers is foundationally there is no self. There is no soul. There is no transcendent subject in any sense at all. And once you get rid of that, you've gotten rid of any grounding for meaning or purpose whatsoever. And it has profound societal implications. So, as you can tell, I'm not very fond of Derrida. It's shock, I know. And some of you tell me I should be more objective in these talks, but oh well. I'm just not going to do that because this is this series is an exploration of how we got to where we are, but I also see where we are as a major problem. So I want us to see how how we started our kind of, slide down into where we are. And so I'm not taking this from a neutral perspective, and I've never tried to be neutral in my explanations of these thinkers. I have read these thinkers. I have tried to represent them accurately, but I am not going to represent them in an unbiased way. Okay, so what are the implications of Derrida's thought? The first is just that there is no objective reason at all. So logocentrism is just the product of the West. West privileges rationality, and so we should just not privilege rationality really at all. I certainly have critiques of Enlightenment rationalism, but that's another subject. But he's not just doing that. He's not just saying there are limits to the use of reason. He's not just saying that Enlightenment rationalism is wrong, but he's saying that there is no really objective reason at all. We shouldn't be expected to have this kind of objective access to the world as it is, or to be able to make logical deductions that actually correspond to reality. There is no meaning. There is no meaning for Derrida. I mean, this is a depressing way to look at the world, but this is why we have such high depression and suicide rates today. But there is no meaning other than that, no transcendent meaning. There is that which is created by the system. So we have systems that create meaning. And these systems, the structures of our culture or our society, education, religion, all of these different places in life, they create meaning. They create a meaning through which we are kind of duped into thinking that there's meaning. So we're brought into those systems and we think that there is something objective behind it, but none of it's actually real. It's just the system itself. So the only meaning that we have is that which is created by these oppositions. So these oppositions create meaning, give us the impression that they're transcendent, that meaning is transcendent. It's actually not, so therefore we need to get rid of it. So there are, for Derrida, and this is true about all of these figures as we've looked at so far, there are no clear ethical norms. And I mentioned here his fighting against age of consent laws, which is something that is not just a fluke. And I don't think it's because people can say, that was bad, but that doesn't invalidate the system. But my point is that's the whole point of the system. Like the whole point of the system is that any societal norms are really just the products of these falsely created hierarchies and binary oppositions. So the way that you deal with that is by reversing all values of society. And so that means things like age of consent. I mean, this is a consistent application of these ideas. It's not just something that is irrelevant. And people brought this up with my Foucault talk, is you're engaging in personal attacks for talking about his personal life, and that's irrelevant. But my point of bringing that up is that it's not irrelevant because it flows out of his system. The point isn't people have flaws and do bad things or think bad things. The point is these things flow out of the ideas that they're promoting. So it's inherent to the system itself. Okay. You could say this is just a false binary opposition. And the binary opposition is that you're privileging adults over children. And you're saying that adults can do things that children can't, because you're saying that they're privileging the adult will over the child's will and saying you have one and they don't. Do you see how this works? Like, you can use this to justify anything. That's awful, but you can't. And here is the essence of Derrida here. The entire Western tradition is wrong. And the entire Western tradition is based on just these falsely constructed oppositions, X versus Y, so these binary oppositions. And so it really has no purpose, meaning, or anything at all. So, this is Derrida. This is the end of this exploration of Derrida. There's a lot to talk about in Derrida. He wrote a lot of books. I didn't even talk about his later more political writings into the 1990s, where some scholars argue that there is a shift in his writing. Some argue that those ideas were already there. But it's clear that there's more of a political kind of take in his later writings. But you can see through all that Derrida is saying here that ultimately his goal is just the destruction of all value and meaning and purpose and the entire culture that we have inherited in the West. I mean, it really is that simple. I mean, it sounds like an extreme overreaction to say that that's true, but it is true. And to some extent, Derrida was successful. I mean, this is what's so surprising about Foucault and Derrida. As you look at their thought and their goals and their ambitions, they kind of succeeded. And the whole world has bought into this rhetoric without really understanding what this rhetoric means or where it's coming from. And it's pretty amazing to me that someone who lived so recently can shift our social discourse and moral discourse and laws of our countries so significantly quickly. It's kind of depressing, but maybe it does also show us that there is hope to change things in other directions quickly as well. I don't know. Well, thanks so much for watching this. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel and the podcast. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.